Welcome back to the Visual Museum of Women in Christianity series on pilgrimage. During the last video, we learned some general information about the practice of pilgrimage, and we took a look at pilgrimage in Scripture. We discussed how pilgrimage can be a specific quest taken with the expectation of meeting with God. And it is also a meaningful metaphor for our entire lives as Christians, sojourners in this world that is not our home, as we are ever seeking our heavenly home and the presence of God. It is important to note that pilgrimage was originally not just a Hebrew or Christian practice. Many ancient religions and cultures practiced pilgrimage, such as Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, and Sikhism. Sacred centers developed that became pilgrimage destinations for the faithful of these different traditions. These trips were meant to strengthen their faith and expose them to holy places associated with the figures and locations of their religion. Not only major religious traditions incorporated pilgrimage as a key theme, it has also been a part of various ancient cultural and ethnic communities like the Shinto in Japan. There exists within us something that longs to journey, to seek adventure, and to experience the divine. Because the practice of pilgrimage to ancient holy destinations has been popular throughout the centuries, their locations have deeply influenced the spiritual and physical landscapes of many countries, and many are World Heritage Sites today. A Christian geography has developed that still draws pilgrimages today. The first through third centuries of the early church were not focused on pilgrimage travel, as this was the time of great persecution and martyrdom of the church. They were more focused on spreading the gospel and of the promise of the return of Christ, which they thought was imminent. The emphasis was more on the Christian life as a pilgrimage. There were those who journeyed to the Holy Land to trace the steps of Jesus, but the practice was not widespread until later. The first recorded account of a pilgrim is the Pilgrim of Bordeaux, circa 333 AD. The 4th century marked the beginning of a more intentional pattern of visiting locations where holy events occurred. The Christian church grew up under the Roman Empire, where pagan Greek and Roman religious traditions built large geographical structures to house rituals and celebrations associated with their gods. People often made pilgrimages, sometimes as individuals and sometimes as parts of groups, to pay homage to a particular god, such as Zeus, Apollo, Athena, or Artemis. These practices form the background against which Christian pilgrimage to sacred places developed in the 4th century. Many of these ancient sites are popular tourist attractions today. It is important for us at the Visual Museum to note that women played a major role in the development and the rise of pilgrimage in the early church in the medieval period, whether they were facilitating the building of shrines, collecting holy relics, undertaking pilgrimages themselves, or even as the objects of veneration for faithful travelers. By the mid 3rd century, Christians were already adorning the walls of their churches and burial places with frescoes, mosaics, and other pieces of art. Pilgrims were already visiting the saints' burial places and sharing feasts with them on special religious days. The biggest change occurred in 312 when Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity and made Christianity legal. This set into action a series of events that marked the beginnings of a new brand of distinctly Christian pilgrimage that grew over the centuries and shaped the religious geography of many nations. Constantine's mother, Helena, embarked on her first trip to Palestine in 326. She was traveling both as an official envoy of the emperor and a pilgrim hoping to visit religious sites. This trip is famous for the account of her finding the Holy Cross of Christ. Pieces of the cross were spread all over the empire as relics, and Helena was integral in the creation of a Christian Holy Land by building churches and shrines, such as the Church on the Mount of Olives and the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, to host future pilgrims to the Holy Land. A network of sacred spaces grew across the empire. Another well-known pilgrim from the early centuries was a woman named Egeria or Etheria, who undertook an impressive 3-year pilgrimage to the Holy Land and wrote about her journey. Dr. Lynn Cohick of the leadership team of the Visual Museum and Amy Brown Hughes wrote a fantastic book called Christian Women in the Patristic World. You should pause this video and order it right away, where they discuss Helena and her influence on pilgrimage, and they also discuss Egeria and her writings. Egeria gives us a glimpse into the people and the places she went along her journey. She describes places in the Holy Land as Christian, without much acknowledgement of the Jewish importance of the sites. Christian facilities were being built on historically Jewish sites and reappropriated for Christian worship and pilgrimage. Many pilgrims walked the long path from Egypt to Mount Sinai through the desert and then turned northwest to Jerusalem. Lodging places, abbeys, and monasteries sprung up along the path to house pilgrims. Cohick and Hughes highlight that Egeria described these places full of worship that included women singing, which was generally not permitted in church services of the time period. These shrines allowed women to be seen and heard. Here are some of Egeria's writings when she approached Mount Sinai. In the meanwhile, we came on foot to a certain place where the mountains through which we were journeying opened out and formed an infinitely great valley, quite flat and extraordinarily beautiful. And across the valley appeared Sinai, the holy mountain of God. Now, on reaching that spot, our holy guides who were with us told us the custom is that prayer should be made by those who arrive here, when from this place the Mount of God is first seen. And this we did. The rise of the cult of the saints was another impetus in the rise of pilgrimage. This refers to the rise of the importance of venerating the heroes of the Christian faith, such as the apostles, martyrs, saints, and others who were significant in the development of the early church. By the mid 3rd century, Christians believed in the intercessory prayer of the saints, and by the 4th century, they started to venerate their bodily remains. The theology of the Incarnation allowed a new attitude toward physical matter to material objects and places, and the idea that these things may facilitate experiences with God. Seeing and touching shrines and relics related to these heroes of the faith became very important, and stories of widespread healings and supernatural events beckoned travelers. The sites of martyrs were very popular as people saw these sacred spots as channels that divine grace could flow through. Churches, abbeys, and shrines were built to house the remains of martyrs and other relics important to the faith. These were often decorated with frescoes, mosaics, icons, and statues. The art shown on the slide is a 9th century mosaic that shows Christ, the apostles, and 2 sisters named Praxedes and Pudentiana, who faithfully served the early church. This piece is from the Visual Museum, and you can read more about these sisters and their story by searching for their collection. Once the practice of pilgrimage really started to take off, it almost became a big business enterprise of the church. Three essential journeys were the desire of most pilgrims: Jerusalem, Rome, and Santiago de Compostela in Spain. In Jerusalem, many of the sites initiated by Helena, the mother of Constantine, were still popular, and new shrines and holy sites continued to sprout up. By the 11th through 12th centuries, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was the most famous pilgrimage destination of all, as it is said to be the site of the crucifixion and tomb of Jesus. Numerous other sacred sites were located throughout Israel as well. Rome was another very important pilgrimage destination. A path of seven churches was laid out that thousands of faithful pilgrims walked and still do today. The Visual Museum displays artwork from many of these locations. The verb to roam actually comes from the fact that so many pilgrims traversed the city of Rome that it became a word that we use today. In 813 AD, the body of Saint James was discovered by a hermit named Pelagius, who was drawn to an old tomb by a mysterious light in Spain. The story spread and the location became a pilgrimage town, with travelers from all over Europe following the Camino de Santiago to the town built around this holy tomb. This is still a popular pilgrimage site today. The medieval imagination pictured divine grace traveling through the physical materials of the sacraments, the waters of baptism, the bread and the wine of the Eucharist. This led to consideration of relics in sacred places as conduits of divine grace as well. Over time, miracles and healings were credited to relics and icons, and stories spread throughout the empire. Bodily relics of saints were divided up into the tiniest pieces to be sent to other locations for pilgrims to visit. Sometimes these relics were purchased by the wealthy. Pieces of bones, teeth, and even strands of hair were seen to have had the same amount of holy power as the entire bodies. Some relics were housed away from the eyes of the pilgrims in enclosed containers called reliquaries. The travelers would need to trust that the objects were in the reliquaries while venerating them. Portraits of saints, called icons, were copied and reproduced as smaller images that pilgrims could buy and carry in their hands. Souvenirs and official metal badges were made and sold at pilgrimage sites. If you purchased an official badge, you could touch the badge to the relic and turn it into a contact relic to carry home for the healing of others. As the practice of pilgrimage rose in popularity and importance to faith, certain theological questions arose. What would happen if someone could not physically travel on a pilgrimage? Some people, because of finances or physical ailments or even religious and monastic orders, found themselves in places where they were not able to travel on pilgrimage. So, what could be done for people in these situations? One thing that arose was pilgrimage by proxy. You can pay a pilgrim to travel for you. And this is where contact relics, like the ones we saw in the previous slide, became important. One would touch the original relic with a piece of cloth, or sometimes oil was poured over an original relic, and the drippings were collected in a jar that could be taken back to the person who could not travel on the pilgrimage. Augustine once wrote of a pilgrim who paid for dirt to be brought back from Jerusalem. He placed it in his bedroom, and his family, livestock, and servants were all healed. Some people created virtual pilgrimages where they researched the number of steps, perhaps from one holy site in Rome to another holy site in Rome, and they would enact those same steps wherever they were in their own places to practice the pilgrimage by proxy. Other theological questions arose as well, and some early theologians spoke out against the practice of pilgrimage at times, and others wrote in favor of it. Gregory of Nyssa in the early 380s wrote positively of his own pilgrimage, but then later decided that traveling to a sacred place for the purpose of meeting with God would imply that God was not omnipresent. There was certainly a theological paradox in this issue. There were questions about whether place pilgrimage supports or undermines the daily pilgrimage of the Christian life that we are all on. Some claimed it was unnecessary and it involved too much expense and danger for people to travel. Early church fathers exposed these themes, and some of these were Origen, Clement of Alexandria, Cyprian, St. John Chrysostom, St. Augustine, and Gregory the Great. Church Father Jerome conceded that Christian reverence for holy relics could appear idolatrous, but denied that the martyrs were actually being worshipped, drawing a line between latria, worship, to God alone, and dulia, veneration, which could be accorded to the saints. Augustine of Hippo, who lived from 354 to 430, was one of the most influential writers on the topic of pilgrimage. He wrote about the existence of two cities, the city of God and the city of man. These cities and their residents live side by side, but they possess different values, ethics, and priorities. Augustine purposed Christians viewing themselves as pilgrims traveling through this world and not being caught up in its own devices. Regardless on where we land on the question of pilgrimage and its theological significances, we can all agree that pilgrimage has given us wonderful and beautiful things in the world of art, literature, architecture, contemplative practices, and other things. The practice of pilgrimage can be credited with the development and elaboration of the church's liturgical, ceremonial, architectural, and artistic traditions on a monumental scale. Not only did Christians become producers and consumers of different kinds of art, but they also came to believe that the physical world is capable of containing and conveying the divine presence. As you peruse the art of the Visual Museum, you will see just a glimpse of the visual art that was often created for the shrines, abbeys, and grand cathedrals for the contemplation and enjoyment of pilgrims. You can search the internet to virtually travel inside some of the most stunning architectural and artistic pilgrimage destinations. These are rich and meaningful as a legacy to the worldwide body of Christ. Medieval literature was captivated by pilgrimage. Canterbury Tales by Chaucer and The Pilgrim's Progress by Bunyan represent some of the most famous novels on the subject. Literature and film are still captivated to this day by stories of pilgrimage and transformation. Pilgrimage also sparked the rise of utilizing religious art in contemplative ways. In Robin Jensen's book, From Idols to Icons, The Emergence of Christian Devotional Images in Late Antiquity, it is stated that Christians made a place for images in their devotional rituals and celebration of liturgical situations that enriched them with sensory experiences and accentuated their embodied dimension. They began to develop practices of spiritual seeing, training in not only what to see, but how to move beyond external experiences to perceive higher spiritual realities. The practice of pilgrimage has given us so much. Please join us for the final video in our series of pilgrimage, where we take a look at modern pilgrimage and ways we all can implement parts of this spiritual practice into our own lives. God bless you, fellow pilgrims.